The Crimean War of 1853 was headed by four major actors. In Britain, there was Foreign Minister Palmerston. He would become the Prime Minister later, but at the time the Prime Minister was Earl of Aberdeen. Another figure in Britain who would become important is Stratford Canning. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas I was ruling at the time, and Prince Menshikov will become important in negotiations with the Ottoman during this conflict. The Ottoman Empire was led by Sultan Abdul-Majid I, and France was led by Emperor Napoleon III. Minor actors in the conflict include the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Sultan ruled over the vast but ever-declining Ottoman Empire, which was made up of many different religions and ethnic groups, and included the important sites present in the Holy Land. Christians would make pilgrimages to these sites every year. Being a majority Muslim country, the Ottoman Empire had formed many treaties over the years with various nations about who would serve as the protectorate of the holy places and also the protectorate of Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. In 1740, they formed such a treaty with the Roman Catholic Church and France as the protectorate of holy places and Catholics. In 1774, a treaty that ended a war between the Ottomans and the Russians was signed. This treaty gave Russians the protectorate of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The Holy Land is a bit out of the way for France, so despite prior agreements, between 1740 and 1820, protection of the holy places naturally became Orthodox monks' responsibility, who lived in Jerusalem unlike Roman Catholic monks. Prior to the start of the Crimean crisis, the Ottomans noticed that the French and Russians were accelerating tensions over the Holy Land in the Middle East. They hoped to placate the French, so they gave them two keys to the Church of the Nativity in Jerusalem. At the same time, secret assurances were made to Russia, assuring them that the keys given to the French to the Church of the Nativity would not actually work. In 1851, Napoleon III is trying to distract from problems at home, so he takes up the cause of French control over the holy places. This would give him prestige, harkening back to the days of Napoleon I, as well as popularity in a majority Catholic country. To accomplish his goals, Napoleon makes an aggressive move, moving warships to the coast of the Ottoman Empire in a strategy called gunboat diplomacy. This would pressure the Ottomans to allow the French to take control of the holy places, and with it, the Christian protectorate. I know you must be wondering about the keys to the church. Did the French ever find out that they don't fit? Well, the answer is yes, and once they found this out, they seized control over the holy places by force. When the Ottomans and the French had established the French protectorate, and the French had seized the holy places, Tsar Nicholas I was worried. He had wanted to ensure the protection of Russian subjects and Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. He had been doing this for years, and so this aggression by the French was surprising and not typical. He especially did not want Orthodox Christians and Russians to fall under the French protectorate while in the Ottoman Empire. Likewise, he wanted to ensure that Turkey didn't fall under Western influence or control. He finally wanted to expand his empire without drawing the ire of the great powers. All of this seemed threatened as the French moved forward aggressively. Let's revisit the French for a moment. Napoleon III had declared himself emperor after being elected president. This upset French liberals who wanted to return to the republican system and end Napoleon's autocratic rule. Napoleon III, therefore, wanted to gain legitimacy through his foreign expeditions, like the one to the Holy Land, and become great like his uncle Napoleon I. He began to do this by sending the warship to the Dardanelles to threaten the Ottomans with gunboat diplomacy, urging them to establish the French protectorate. He also sent Charles de la Valette, a zealous member of the Catholic clerical party in France, to accomplish this, to talk to the Ottomans about the French protectorate. This detail shows you how religion played somewhat of a role in this conflict. Here's some context for this conflict. Around Europe at this time, nationalism and uprisings were happening everywhere. Slavic peoples, Hungarians, and Italians wanted freedom from Austria. Muslim peoples of the Caucasus wanted independence from Russia, and Orthodox peoples like the Serbs, Bulgars, and Greeks wanted independence from the Ottomans. All of this created an environment of instability, an environment that threatened the concert of Europe, prompting intervention from other great powers. For example, Russia had intervened to help Austria put down the Hungarian uprising in 1848, and Britain had repeatedly come to the Ottoman Empire's aid. Nationalist and ethnic uprisings signaled that the age of empires was coming to an end. For the Crimean crisis, let's focus on the Ottomans. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. It had been in a steady state of decline for years, it had a crumbling economy, and ethnic divisions threatened independence movements that would break up the empire. Other great powers discussed the Eastern Question, which referred to the inevitable fall of the Ottoman Empire and the question regarding what would become of that territory and the balance of power in Europe when the Ottoman Empire finally fell. Earl of Aberdeen was the prime minister in Britain at the time. He favored Russia over France, which was highly irregular for Britain at the time. No one else really thought that. But due to Aberdeen's signals, Tsar Nicholas was certain that Britain would not come to bat for the Ottomans if the Russians ended up having to invade the Ottoman Empire. Foreign Minister Palmerston upheld the traditional British foreign policy approach of defending the Ottoman Empire and viewed Russia's actions with suspicion. Diplomat Stratford Canning was related to George Canning, a former British prime minister that Tsar Nicholas I disliked. Due to this, Stratford was rejected the ambassadorship to Russia. The Tsar had refused to receive him. Stratford never got over this event and always carried a personal grudge against the Tsar. He ended up becoming chief diplomat to the Ottoman Empire. In this position, he urged the Ottomans not to compromise with the Russians. Britain viewed its navy as an effective bargaining tool against both the Russians and the Ottomans. In 1833, a treaty between the Russians and the Ottomans stated that during a time of war, the Dardanelles Straits would be closed. This was known as the Treaty of the Royal Pier. Britain wanted to end this treaty and open the straits in case of a war with Russia. Britain feared Russia's military growth in the Black Sea. These concerns may have been the catalyst for Britain's entry into the Crimean crisis. Let's go over the timeline of negotiations. The French are the immediate cause with the establishment of the French Protectorate with the Ottomans. Britain acts as a mediator between the Russians and the Ottomans with negotiations. Russia responds to the establishment of the French Protectorate and the Ottomans' betrayal by referencing previous treaties that gave them the protectorate status. This is when Napoleon sends his warship to Constantinople, enacting his strategy of gunboat diplomacy. Then, Russia sends her diplomats to Britain and France to ask them to remain neutral in the conflict. Meanwhile, Menshikov goes to the Ottomans and begins negotiations. First, he demands protectorate over 12 million Orthodox living in the Ottoman Empire. A compromise is reached regarding the Orthodox access to the Holy Lands. After many compromises, the Ottomans flatly reject the final compromise, urged on by Stratford. As the conflict heats up, England and France send their navies to the Dardanelles, preparing for war. Russia moves their troops to the Danubian principalities, preparing to invade the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans then declare war on Russia. At the Battle of Sinop, Russia sinks the Ottoman fleet, which prompts the British and French to fully join the conflict on the side of the Ottomans. So what about Sardinia, Piedmont, and Austria-Hungary? Sardinia joins the war against the Russians to gain British and French favor for Italian unification. Basically, they join the conflict to advance domestic goals. Austria-Hungary is threatened by Russia and concerned that they might invade the Danubian principalities. They're also focused on ethnic conflicts within their borders. Throughout the war, they're hostile to Russia and eventually forced them to withdraw from the Ottoman territory of the Danubian principalities in 1854. Russia had wanted Austria to remain neutral. The bloodiest and most significant war in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars and before World War I, the Crimean War, will recall for some the Russian Federation's annexation of Crimea in 2014, not the historical War of 1853. Despite its absence from many history curricula, the Crimean War is significant as a predecessor to World War I, a major event in the gradual fall of the Ottoman Empire, and perhaps the earliest look at what would become the geopolitical makeup of modern Europe. Now that we've reviewed the historical points, how do we analyze the lead up to one of the largest crises of the 19th century? A typical interpretation of the crisis goes like this. Russia was using the dispute over the holy places as a Trojan horse to pursue greater imperialist designs, particularly the seizure of the city of Constantinople, the birthplace of Orthodox Christianity. Maybe there is some truth to this. Nicholas's original demand of the Russian protectorate of all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire would have been one way to usurp Ottoman authority over some 12 million of their own subjects. But is it correct to say that the French and English fought the war to protect the Ottoman Empire from Russian encroachment? Hardly. One way this interpretation has proved lasting is the fact that the Ottomans actively sought to associate their independence with European safety. In my opinion, it is most correct to say that the war was fought against Russia, not so much for the Ottomans. Napoleon was eager to distract from problems at home by engaging in prestige projects abroad. Firstly, he wished to form an alliance with the British. He proved successful and not only achieved this alliance, but he was able to control the movements of the British Navy and lead his ally into war, according to the historian Brisson Gooch. Hoping to gain the favor of the Catholic Church, he saw the establishment of a French protectorate as too good an opportunity to pass up. This status was practically pointless, as roughly 100 Catholic pilgrims made the journey to Jerusalem per year, a fraction of the 12,000 total annual Christian pilgrims. Napoleon was within his rights de jure to pursue this course, but Nicholas and the Orthodox had maintained the de facto protectorate for years. Due to Napoleon's pursuit for prestige, Nicholas likely felt the need to protect millions of Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire from a French overtaking. Historian Brisson Gooch writes, "Rioting mobs in Constantinople, Jerusalem, and St. Petersburg asked whether millions of Greeks were to stand quietly and be robbed by these wretched Turks to gratify a few French tourists. While modern relations between the two churches are positive, constant scuffles between Orthodox and Catholic religions were taking place in the Holy Land around this time, validating Nicholas's concern." Conflicting with the accepted narrative of Ottoman protection, the British had promised Russia that they would remain neutral in the conflict as late as February of 1853. When Nicholas invaded the Ottoman Empire in July of 1853, he was certain the move would go unopposed. Perhaps Britain underestimated Russian military capability, especially their ability to destroy the Ottoman fleet at Sinop. Seeing this was cause for great concern in Britain. The realization of growing power in the Near East, a threat to nearby British colonies such as India and the balance of power in Europe, moved the British to action. At most, the British can be faulted for their indecisiveness and unclear communication with Russia, who did not at all anticipate their intervention. Had Nicholas expected active military involvement, negotiations could have taken an alternate, more productive course. One British figure in particular exacerbated the potential for conflict: Stratford Canning. Remember, he's the one who was rejected the Russian ambassadorship by the Tsar. As British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Stratford took it upon himself to assure the Sultan that Britain would fight on the behalf of the Ottomans. In actuality, Britain had been acting as a mediator between the Ottoman Empire and Russia in hope for a diplomatic resolution. Egged on by Stratford, the Sultan became increasingly bold and hostile to Russia's proposals. Just when Menshikov's compromise was to be signed, the Sultan did an about-face and wholly rejected the agreement. Had the Sultan been less confident in the British backing and had agreed to compromise, the war may have ended before it began. The Crimean War was ignited by a desire to satisfy personal ego, both that of Napoleon III and that of a disgraced Stratford Canning. Without Napoleon's symbolic return to a defunct treaty, and without Stratford's influence on the Sultan partially motivated by a personal grudge, the crisis may have been resolved diplomatically or never started. Just as a diplomatic failure and entangling alliances between the British and the Ottomans and the British and the French led to this conflict, so too would these features lead to World War I less than a century later. The Crimean War was the beginning of what would become the unmistakable dichotomy between Western Europe and the East, including Russia.